Hello, my name is Sean Ryan, and I'm doing a presentation today on the applications of hyperequity on subgroup achievement gaps. This study is focused on the Clarkston Community Schools, of which the study was conducted. What is equity and how is it applied in the school context? Equity is that theme that not all is equal, but that resources and support should be distributed based on need. Right now, Clarkston Community Schools is going through a strategic planning process where we're putting a high value on equity as an overarching theme. Equities in schools can take many different forms. They can be equities in terms of access to services such as healthcare and programming, and it also can be looked at in terms of student achievement, which is commonly how equity is measured as an outcome. For this process, Clarkston Schools is looking at equity in a way that not as a standard investment in schools, but what does it actually take to make sure that all the subgroups, or at least a focused subgroup, can perform at a high level, mirroring other students that are in the program as well. We call this notion hyperequity, and we really look at it as kind of a theme, but kind of a responsibility of schools and communities to make sure that all kids have a voice and are accounted for. Specifically, Clarkston, within its mission and vision, as you can see, has a high value with an overarching equity above all the four pillars, which we call our four major goal areas, which is whole person development, foundation and academic skills, student-focused learning, and future pathways. We believe that equity has a place in all of these areas, and that they, at one point or another, that these areas also tie together to give a student their complete experience. Looking at equity for the purpose of the study, we're focusing mainly on the foundational academic skills, but obviously there's a broader span that will go into providing an impact in those areas. Clarkston is also highly interested in being a high reliability school district, especially in the context of equity, looking at all our schools, no matter what side of town they're on, and their ratios of students, whether it be racial, socioeconomic status, special ed status, or English proficiency or race, have equal opportunity and access to programs and can be also supported to success. Looking at equity through the context of the student achievement piece, we want to apply multiple measures to really get a broader understanding of that equity or that achievement gap piece overall. Because equity exists in a context, really it's not going to be on its own, but really can be defined qualitatively and quantitatively. And achievement gaps linked through equity can be evaluated at a baseline through four different areas in those multiple measures, which are program data, demographic data, student achievement data, and perception data. As part of this presentation, we're going to walk through all four of those areas as it relates to equity gaps in Clarkston Community Schools and programming that have been identified. The specific programming going to be examined as part of this process is the Clarkston Math and Literacy Program data. Looking at Clarkston in terms of literacy, it's employing a K-5 balanced literacy approach. We've been focused on the Lucy Calkins workshop model within those 7 years. And in the last year, we've had the additional supportive literacy coaches at each one of our 7 elementaries. In the math area, the district utilizes a K-5 math workshop model, and we use Bridges resources to support that workshop model on a day-to-day basis. And we've been working with this Bridges materials for approximately 3 years, and we're in the midst of a 5-year vertical alignment piece to bring all teachers up to the comfort level and ability and instructional level that we want them for that math workshop model. Much of our effort for the math workshop development has been through teacher laboratories or teachers teaching teachers in the context of within their classrooms. And we found master teachers within these areas to host teachers that are in different areas of development within the process for math to really have an opportunity to see the teaching and learning in action. And we've had amazing feedback from both staff and looking at the overall competency level of our elementary division within this math workshop model. When looking at the level of student data, We focus on the areas of demographics. We see that Clarkston Community Schools, of our 7 elementaries, can be really divided into 2 classes. We have not much diversity, as I will show, in terms of many areas, which is ethnic, racial, or some of the other areas, but when it comes to diversity of economics and mobility, Clarkston shows a high level of variance. To illustrate that, I picked 2 of our district's elementaries that are the other opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of this socioeconomic status to kind of serve as examples which really match up with the rest of the schools in the district. The 2 buildings are Bailey Lake Elementary and North Sashabaw Elementary. When looking at the schools, Bailey Lake Elementary represents a student population that has roughly 11% disadvantaged students and very low diversity in terms of overall racial diversity, with roughly 6% Hispanic and 86% white, and special ed levels around 11%, which is relatively low average in the district, and also a very small number of English language learners at 3%. North Sashabaw Elementary, on the other hand, has approximately 63% disadvantaged students and a little bit higher diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, with only 74% white and coming behind with an 18% Hispanic Latino and then 3% African American and 4% Asian. North Sashabaw special education numbers at 19% are much higher than Bailey Lakes, as it's 11% of English language learners as well. How does this differential pan out in the achievement levels within the school district? Well, first, taking a snapshot of the entire district, you see that the district is at roughly 57% competency on average for ELA and 54% for math. The socioeconomic averages for the district is 27%, and the special education average is 15%. As was illustrated in the last slides, there's definitely, the average does not describe Clarkston Community Schools, but more of it's on 2 different halves that reach that average that are pretty far apart. If you look at, though, the overall achievement, even on this average within Clarkston Community Schools, Clarkston fares well both against the county and the state averages in terms of both MSTEP, ELA, and math. This has been a tradition for many years, and it's only been this year that we began looking at some of the subgroup data to see if the average really pans out for all students. If you look at the 2018 MSTEP demographic data and achievement from all 7 elementaries, just a snapshot to see what that average is composed of, you really see a stark contrast between buildings that have higher socioeconomic students that struggle or disadvantaged students versus students with low academic struggle, or academics versus their socioeconomic status. In other words, there's a very clear correlation, at least looking at this level of data, both in math and in ELA, that the higher degree of disadvantaged students at a particular elementary, the overall lower performance in both math and ELA. And it's also interesting to note that the special ed numbers at these buildings are also higher. Again, with more disadvantaged students comes a higher population of special ed students at those sites as well. More interestingly, as you dig deeper into the data, you see that within the numbers, that if you look at the disadvantaged students and advantaged students at both buildings, a couple interesting phenomena are noted. One is that in comparison between North Sash and Bailey Lake, that if you are a disadvantaged student at Bailey Lake, even though that much lower percentage, your achievement is much higher than that of a student at North Sash. And by token, non-disadvantaged students perform much better at Bailey Lake than they do at North Sash, kind of signifying that at some level where there's higher struggle with socioeconomic struggles, it really pans through the entire school in terms of overall achievement. And there's probably many different reasons that can be attributed to that, and really outside the scope of this analysis at this point. It's also interesting to note that these trends also hold through for special education and limited English language proficient students. Both groups perform better at the school that has lower number of disadvantaged students overall. And if you look at the trend in not only English language arts, but in math, this achievement data holds true. it's very consistent that these student subgroups are not being represented in terms of overall success as reflected by each of these buildings. Even though the district average provides one story, definitely digging into the individual looks at these buildings and how their subgroups perform clearly indicates that there's some pretty strong discrepancy in the reliability, at least of the programming in Clarkson Community Schools, as it relates back to students with higher SES disadvantaged state. When looking at the self-perception data, the survey data, we looked at both buildings in terms of the students' perception on whether they were solid mathematicians or good readers. And this is simply from the eyes of the students at these schools. And although both schools reported back a fairly high level of self-appreciation for these areas, clearly Bailey Lake Elementary, the students with less disadvantaged students seem to have a proportionally higher level of self-reflection on their abilities. As we know that self-perception has a strong correlation with achievement in students, this is also a data point of kind of looking at the whole. So, how do we narrow these gaps in performance within Clarkson Community Schools and within our higher and lower schools in terms of number of disadvantaged students? Well, first, the key equity observations is obviously there's a large disparity in Clarkson schools in terms of building socioeconomic status, that student success rates are lower for students that are struggling or disadvantaged, and that both groups of disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged students perform lower at buildings that have an overall higher level of students that are disadvantaged. We also noted that as a whole, looking at all 7 buildings, that Clarkson Schools is not a high reliability school district at this point, and at least from the self-perception of the students, there's a slightly more negative look at their self-proficiency within those math and language arts areas as non-students that are at a higher mobile school. The next question is obviously what can be done in terms of specific program enhancements and other actions by the school district and schools to help narrow these gaps, specifically targeting the differential between socioeconomic status at these buildings. Well, looking at the research, clearly, that continued look at curriculum alignment and proper diagnostic and assessment of the students will always bring to a stronger program, and also looking at the behavior and also trauma-informed supports at these schools and what kind of resources they have to provide more of a whole child support model to make sure that the areas that the students might be struggling outside of school or bring into school are serviced, and again, an attempt to help promote their overall achievement and experience in school. We also know from the research that students that are struggling with socioeconomic status also need to be accounted for in terms of their access to summer and outside the day programming, and that some of the differential between overall achievement between high and low SES students starts almost literally when they come out of the womb, and providing strong preschool and early childhood programs and interventions is key. The district is also looking at working with the buildings in terms of having their class sizes at as low as possible, especially related to research. We think that we need to kind of continue to enhance and promote these homeschool partnerships in terms of not only parent engagement, but parent development and support, because we know stronger families can bring about better supports for students in schools, as well as having an eye towards the physical and mental health of our students by placing clinics or other supports directly at those sites. We have to stay on course. We look at, to pursue that high reliability status, we need to look at each building as an individual site and the challenges they have. We need to promote that consistency and quality of leadership at every level, and look at long-term progress monitoring, that this is not a one-year fix, but it's going to require many years of sustained research-driven practices to narrow that gap. And obviously, there's also going to be an implication for our middle and high school as we narrow this gap and students have better opportunity to explore the opportunities and avenues at the secondary buildings as well. So in conclusion, it's important, we think, that we monitor the subgroups and make sure they have a voice. We want to continue this notion of hyperactivity or hyperequity, and that we want to become a high reliability school district. We recognize the broader application areas of equity, and that really promoting in our public system and our democracy as a whole.